The energy transition is very much about building stuff, building infrastructure, right? And so how can you do that? Well, with a lot of investment, and that a lot of investment can only come with partnering with the private sector. And I do think that's something that the president-elect understands well.
Hello and welcome to Energy 360, the podcast from the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. I'm Quill Robinson. This week, we discuss the outlook for Mexico's climate and energy policies in light of the recent election of President Claudia Sheinbaum. Sheinbaum is expected to continue many of her predecessor's energy and climate policies. But how might things shift? Ben Cahill is joined by Diego Rivera Rivota of Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. I'll turn it over to Ben now to kick off the conversation.
In early June, Claudia Sheinbaum was elected as Mexico's first female president. Sheinbaum, a climate scientist by background and the former mayor of Mexico City, won a resounding victory. Her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, widely known as AMLO, has pursued an idiosyncratic energy policy. AMLO sought to protect the national oil company, Pemex, and the Federal Electricity Commission, or CFE, as state champions in oil and gas and the power sector. His government was criticized for hostility to foreign investment, crippling of regulatory agencies, and lack of contract sanctity for energy investors, including in renewable energy. Claudia Sheinbaum is a member of AMLO's Morena party and has vowed to continue many of his policies. But given her academic background and the natural desire for presidents to carve their own path, will her energy and climate policies be different? How much independent authority will she have? To answer these questions, I'm really pleased to welcome Diego Rivera Rivota to the podcast. Diego, it's really great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining.
Ben, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So lots to discuss. We're more than a month on from the election results, but I wonder if you could just start by recapping the election results for us. So this was a landslide victory in the presidential race. It was a thumping victory for Morena too. How do the results in Congress and at the state level affect presidential authority?
Sure thing. And I'll start with that. That's an excellent point to share with the audience that may not be extremely familiar with elections in Mexico. We Mexicans did not only elected president, but also the whole Congress. So that means two chambers. It's a system similar to one of the United States, a lower chamber, a higher chamber. The Chamber of Deputies, there are 500 deputies. On the Senate, 128 senators. And all of them were up, those seats were up for grabs, as well as 9 states. That's including Mexico City. That formally is not a state, but of course, it's a very important entity. And so in that sense, starting with the president, indeed, it was a very clear, resounding victory of 60% over the runner-up, Xochitl Gálvez, who only captured 27% of the vote. There was a third candidate that got 10% of the vote. So that is like a resounding victory. It's important to say that Claudia Sheinbaum got even more votes in absolute numbers than her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And an important thing that I believe that's really where the surprise was on June 2nd, it was not that much that she won the election, but really the margin, the rate by the one she won, and that was also represented to an extent on a massive majority of Morena and her coalition, that are two main parties coaligated to Morena that are important, that allowed them to have a virtual supermajority in Congress. An important thing to mention there is that the specific and official numbers of the composition of both chambers would only be known in August. It is highly likely that in the Chamber of Deputies, there is that supermajority. And in the Senate, that they may get a little bit short by a few numbers, maybe 4, maybe 5. We'll see how's that. But what that definitely leaves a heavy footprint of that supermajority of 2/3 in both chambers of Congress, which will allow them to, of course, change any legal framework, but also to amend the Constitution. And that's a major achievement on the coalition, but also a major message of concentration of power, really, and responsibility that the governing coalition will have. And lastly, on the local governments, that is relevant too for different regions. Out of the 9, 7 were won by Morena. That includes Mexico City, that has been long governed by the party, but also some stronghold states long held by the opposition, like Yucatan, for instance, right? That leaves Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador party with 24 out of 32 states under their power, which is quite massive, as we know. As for the election, I think I leave it there. An absolutely resounding victory, and with some details on that supermajority to be elected or to be officially disclosed in August. And perhaps one point that is absolutely massive and that I haven't seen a lot in media, especially in foreign media, is that we have ahead a very important month, September. Why is that? Because the incoming Congress, both chambers, start their duties on September 1st. But during that month, there's an overlap with the sitting president. So you have a month of the sitting president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and the new Congress, this new superpowered Congress. So that means that during that month, during those last 30 days, Andrés Manuel López Obrador will have more power in Congress than he has ever had. He's very aware of that, and the governing coalition is very aware of that. And Claudia Sheinbaum would only take power on October 1st. So there is a number of reforms, a number of amendments that are already on the works to precisely do that. Amend the constitution, change legal framework. And there's a specific reform that has got most of the attention, which is reforming the judicial power. And that means severe recalling of the system. That means changing the composition of the Supreme Court of Justice and how it is elected. That means changing how all judges, ministers, and magistrates are elected across the country. That is a massive recalling of the checks and balances system and a reaccommodation, really, of how power is detained in Mexico. That, of course, has created a number of critics on all sides from the political spectrum. And right now we're in a process of discussion of these reforms, but certainly that raises one point is like the Supreme Court of Justice will be reduced from 11 justices to 9, and they will be elected by popular vote. To the extent that I'm aware, there is only one country that does that to this point, which is Bolivia. This really has created some nervousness in markets and for investors. And so we saw, for instance, fears on the exchange rate and a depreciation about 10% in the first month after the election. That has been reduced now. And so right now, the peso is about 4% above its value before the election. So I'll leave it there as for the election.
Yeah, that background is extremely helpful. I mean, some of my colleagues at CSIS in our Americas program have written about the concentration of executive authority in Mexico. What you're describing is a landscape that's really radically changed under AMLO in the last 6 years. He is extremely popular. I mean, his approval ratings are very high, even at the end of his term. From my outsider's perspective, it's kind of a remarkable turn of events because this is a relatively new party, right? I mean, for decades, Mexico was sort of a single party system. Morena is a fairly new party. I think it was viewed initially as pretty personalized. And now, as you said, it's got this extensive base of support at the state level and Congress as well. So pretty big turn of events.
Indeed, Ben. Morena was created by Andrés Manuel López Obrador after his second run for president after 2012. And indeed, they managed to consolidate, to grab the power very much around the personality and the individual charisma of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And so that really has cemented a coalition, really. And I think that's an important point to do. Morena, which stands for Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, which is like National Regeneration Movement, no? Claims to be more than a political party, a movement, but that has managed to gather a coalition really from anywhere in between former actual Communist Party affiliates back in the 80s, 70s, historical figures, to people really quite conservative, evangelist at some point, and anything in between, including, different officials or politicians from all political parties, really, from the right, from the left, from the center. So I think that's an important thing in which all that coalition of power, all that group that gathered together has at its cement, at its very glue, the personality and the charisma of AMLO. So I think that's an important thing, and we'll see how that manages and how that evolves once he's not in power, or at least not in the main picture of power. I think that's a very interesting development, and where, a lot of what will happen the next 6 years in Mexico will be happening. But I do think that it's not exaggeration to say that we're living historical moments and that we are at the start of a new political regime in Mexico. what have started in the 90s, some people define it in 94, 97, maybe the year 2000, when the first non-pre, after 70 years of governing by the same party, we have a system of essentially three political parties, one to the right, one to the left, and the former hegemonic party governing. I think that system really collapsed. Even the leftist party lost its registry. It's pretty much not official yet, but pretty much dead, right? So that just tells you how that former political system is nothing but dead. And now we are at the start of a new regime.
Yeah, fascinating. So let's talk about the new president's background and her worldview. Given the context of that landscape of various interests within the Morena party, how diverse they are, I think one of the questions that has been covered a lot in the media is what will look different under Sheinbaum? She's vowed continuity, but she's got quite a different background. As I mentioned, she's a climate scientist. She's got a pretty impressive publication record. She was actually an author for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And when she was mayor of Mexico City, she seemed to pay some attention to green energy projects. So specifically on energy and climate issues, she seems to come at things from a slightly different perspective than AMLO. I wonder if you could just talk at a high level to start out about what we know about her worldview, the way that she frames energy and climate issues, and how important that's likely to be relative to other priorities.
That's a great question, Ben. And I think we're all scratching our heads to see how the author, the climate scientist, will use the highest office in power in Mexico to perform and to implement energy and climate policy. So first of all, I totally agree with you. It's definitely a very interesting character that has got a lot of attention globally and for good reason, right? Like, I don't think there's any other head of state that has a more extensive Google Scholar, list of publications, for instance, right? Like, indeed, she was an extensively published author. I read some of her papers, really interesting, lots of it on the demand side, on the use of energy, on energy access, for instance. There is one that was published, I believe, in 2015 around renewable energy developments in the southern state of Oaxaca and the social tensions that got with local population. So indeed, the knowledge there for the energy system, for the transition, for renewable energy is clearly there. At the same time, during at least the last 10 years, she has been a full-time politician, right? Before she was mayor of Mexico City during the previous 6 years, she was mayor of a district, we call it alcaldía, right? And she was for 3 years governing that. And I would say like she had a bit of a mixed track record in terms of environmental and energy policy. And then obviously during the political campaign, it's clear that she was aligning to her predecessor while doing so. How is her actual program and implementation will look like? I think that's something that is very interesting and we'll be looking with a lot of detail. We can have some sketches of that and happy to go in detail later on with it from her political program during the campaign. There's this specific document called like 100 Steps to the Transformation where she outlined some of these policies. And during the campaign trail, she announced some. And even now that there have been a few appointments, we can start to see a little bit more landed details on how energy and climate policy will look like in the next 6 years in Mexico.
Yeah, so let's unpack a couple of those things that you mentioned. And maybe to take a step back to give a sense of what AMLO has done during his time in office, right? So AMLO really unwound a lot of the changes that were made under the constitutional reforms that opened up foreign investment in the oil and gas industry in Mexico, liberalized the investment regime for renewables. There was an effort to kind of, I think, take away the independent authority of regulatory agencies. A lot of his policies were seen as quite hostile to foreign investment in the energy sector. But he also had this kind of unique view of the role of state companies, state champions. I mean, a very strong sense that Mexico needs national champions, that Pemex should be prized, CFE should be prized. This view of fossil fuels as a really strategically important industry, and even interventions to kind of force Mexico to do these really expensive investments like the Dos Bocas refinery. So it is a little bit unique to AMLO. His energy policy reflected kind of a unique worldview, right? So that's the context for what's happened in the last couple of years. I guess just an overarching question. Do you think the attitude towards foreign investment or private investment in energy will change under this new government?
That's indeed another tough question, Ben. But I would say in short that I see some signs that it will change for the good, that there will be some more opportunities to do so. But I don't think we're going back to the scheme that we were prior to AMLO during 2014 to 2018. But I guess there would be definitely some more field participation with newer rules for that. So we'll see in detail how that looks like. And that's really where the details may be and like the key areas of such investments and the vehicles of doing so. But we'll see how that goes. On the state-owned companies role that you mentioned, I think that's something very important. And I think for folks listening that, maybe are just more to the US energy system, which is one of mostly free market rules, bunch of private participants, strong regulators here and there, less so, more so, right? Like ERCOT operates on a way in the Northeast of the United States in a bit of a different way. But what we do have in Mexico, it's an energy system, both on the oil and gas and also on the power sector, in which you have two dominant state-owned companies, right? Which were formerly integrated monopolies. And by the way, that's something that is very common in different developing countries across the world, not only in Latin America and Southeast Asia. We have strong hold of that in the Middle East, evidently, but even also in Europe, right? We do see the role of some state-owned companies that have been very successful, very well run, right? Like I guess the EDF in France is a good example. Norway always come as the most successful, a bit of a cliche thing. But let's say national oil companies in that state, but also state-owned electrical utilities have a massive role. And in the case of Mexico, I think that's a key element that with the reforms that you mentioned in 2013 and 14, there was an opportunity to reform them within. And I think there were some positive signs that happened in both of those companies. I would say, especially on the electrical utility, CFE. But at the same time, some of its areas that were troubled, not for years, but for decades of poor management, quite frankly, in some cases, just like wrong decisions taken off, underinvestment, and in some cases, even, blatant corruption, that put some areas of these state-owned champions in a very tough situation, in a critical situation that when AMLO came to power, I think his view of the energy sector is it was one that had to be understood under an ownership system. It mattered. The priority was that the ownership should be under the hands of the state or on the hands of the state. And hence, any attempt to threaten that was something, quote unquote, bad, negative, right? Whether the considerations about how much emissions that represented, how much investment that represented, how efficient that was, I think that was a consideration on a second level of importance. And I think that's a better framework to explain how was the view and the term of these policies during the past 6 years, right? And so,
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it was basically a populist framing of private investment in energy, in which AMLO portrayed it as giving away important state assets to private investors who don't really care about creating jobs or creating benefits for Mexicans. And it's important to say, I think that that populist framing of things seemed to be quite popular politically, right? It was definitely had a big chilling impact on private investment, including in renewables. But as a political platform, it was part of AMLO's broader worldview. And that's why taking away independent regulatory authority, cutting the legs out from under some of the private investment that happened in renewables, it was all in service of this broader framing of the issue. Does that sound correct to you?
It is indeed a very popular set of policies, right? And the best way to look at it is at the polls on the popularity of AMLO and the results of the election. I think that's undoubtedly true. And I think there's even a point of discussion really more broadly, if you want, even philosophically, on like, what should the role of the state be on the energy sector? And perhaps, direct action by the state in a broader way than what we see in the US, for instance, it has its benefits, right? Like I'm thinking in stuff like nuclear energy, for instance, right? On the transmission network, is that better? I think that's a very legitimate debate. What I think personally is like robust regulators, highly technically with high knowledge, is essential for a better investment. And I think like the bulk of state presence should be there, right? On effectively regulating and allowing, there's no balance check of any company in the world that can allow itself to perform the kind of investments that are required in the context of the energy transition, right? Like no company by itself can do it, be it public, be it private. So that's very much the case in Mexico, right? The energy transition is very much about building stuff, building infrastructure, right? And so How can you do that? Well, with a lot of investment, and that a lot of investment can only come with partnering with the private sector. And I do think that's something that the president-elect understands well. I think she's very familiar with it. I think some people in her team are too. And I think it'd be interesting how she manages to build around vehicles, avenues of such investment, at the same time, keeping some of these political or marrying the political legacy of AMLO with these challenges ahead.
I think that's a really important point. And we saw with renewable energy, for example, that clearly Mexico has a lot of potential, in particular for solar power. And as I understand it, there were some initial bid rounds where companies showed a lot of interest. Private investors were very willing to put capital into Mexico. But then new rules were introduced that changed the dispatch order, undercut contract sanctity, undercut rule of law, and it just killed off private investment and really prioritized the role of CFE, right? And prioritized the role of fuel oil in power generation, which of course has negative environmental impacts. So I totally agree that, we're coming off a 6-year presidential term where there's been a real chilling factor on private investment. So understanding, I think, the nuances of, in particular, renewables and what President Sheinbaum may do will be quite important.
Yeah, I think the particular aspect on renewable energy is one very relevant because of the challenging situation in which the Mexican power sector is. And people in Mexico in general, we Mexicans proud ourselves to see Mexico as a country, I guess many countries do that, but like of blessed with a number of natural resources. We got oil, we got gas, we got the best beaches, we got the, amazing food, we got like sun and wind and stuff. Well, sometimes that's a bit exaggerated. Sometimes it's way too exaggerated. But when we look at solar and wind potential in Mexico, it is not exaggeration. Mexico has world-class resources that amount to multiply the current infrastructure by many factors, right? So the fact that that has not grown is already standing behind where we could be or where we should be. And so, for instance, during the previous year, really one look, some statistics between 2016 and say 2021, I believe. I have that a bit drill in my mind. Solar and wind power generation represented about, in 2016, just over 1% of the total power generation in Mexico. That amount, if we look 2021, 22, amounted combined to 12% of power generation with an increase on power demand. So that's a massive increase of over 10 percentage points. That includes incremental growth of power that happened, unlike the United States during those years. And so that just tells us how much investment and infrastructure was built during those years. Then that really stabilized and really has been stagnant ever since 2022. There were some legacy projects, but really during the last couple of years, that pipeline of projects really has been pretty sluggish. And that, of course, comes from an uncertainty for investors, right? Like there are several cases in different courts, important when we were talking about the judicial power, but really many of my colleagues, if one look at it, that were energy analysts, former bureaucrats, working in companies, really they have struggled even to find other jobs. And really the ones that have been on a bargaining situation are lawyers, right? That now are the experts on that. So really I just see a bit of a missed opportunity during the last few years on renewable energy investment, in which is something that Mexico can really take off and materialize that massive potential, that untapped potential. I'll give you just a data point that talks of the dire situation in which we are. So Mexico has had this goal of generating 35% of generation coming from, and I'm going to put quote unquote clean sources. And I'll tell you why that is that quote unquote clean sources. But essentially 35% of that. And we were going on a okay trend heading there. Today, in 2024, really with the full data points of 2023, only 22% of power generation came from renewable plus nuclear sources, far away from that 35%. The reason of that quote unquote clean energy I meant is because in official accounts, and this is like the legal way it was designed back then, added to clean sources, highly efficient combined heat and power, which is basically gas-fired generation, which by all means in any serious international discussion, that wouldn't be carbon-free electricity. And that would give a couple extra percentage points. But really what we are is very sure from that goal that it's a legal one, right? That it was 35% of clean power coming out of the total by 2024. We're very far from achieving that, despite having enormous resources to do so. So really, there's a massive challenge to head there. And I would, beyond the power sector, I do want to highlight, I think right now Mexico has a bit of four major challenges on the energy sector. One is this one that we talk about, untapping renewable power, the generation side of things, in which also a lot of critics have said that it has to come with other, it's variable sources, mostly solar and wind. We do need storage. There are technologies that are under development, and it will continue to grow and consolidate. We need two other stable sources. Natural gas is part of the solution. I think so. It's been increasing. That's the bulk of additions already. I think on that side of things, Mexico is probably in a good way just to meet incremental demand. Should Mexico keep building natural gas power stations at the rate we have been doing it in the past 5 years? I think that's something that we can argue about. And I think there are different sides of the tables on that debate, but that's definitely an element. So power generation on the electrical side. Then another one is on the power sector too, transmission. The transmission grid, and that is something, I work myself at CFE at the state-owned utility for decades, a system in which really has been underinvested. Really, it has been on a very unstable, fragile situation, because the engineers, the ones that are planning the network, they said okay, we have massive congestion in so-and-so corridor. We need to do some redundancy here and there. We need to increase the access here because there is incremental demand coming in the next 2 or 3 years. And that has been postponed, right? And I think that's somewhere that requires a lot of attention. I'm writing myself a piece about it. Sorry for the bit of self-promotion there, but I'll share with you later on. And then I think the two other challenges, one is with Pemex, the national oil company, especially from its financial point. And then happy to delve a little bit more into that. But there are some parts of Pemex that are very profitable, that work very well, and there are others that clearly do not. And that represents already a massive source of strain for public finances in Mexico in terms of government altogether. And then the fourth one is really the role of natural gas on the energy system more broadly. Of course, in power that we already talked about, but also, natural gas represents about 63% of power generation in Mexico. That's pretty high by any standards globally. Most of that, about 70% of all natural gas consumed in Mexico, comes from imports from a single source. And that is the state of Texas in the United States. That's something that we are very familiar with it. And that represents, when it flows well, an affordable, cheap source of energy with relatively low emissions. But also when it doesn't work, when it happens, there are some extreme weather events, technical issues, etc., that represents a severe problem of energy security as well. And then that leads also to a challenge to reduce emissions further on. On the one hand, already from methane emissions, right? Things like leaks, things like flaring, that it's pretty prevalent in the regions where that gas is produced, but also on the Mexican side, as well as locking in perhaps some space that could be used in the power sector or really on the industrial sector too, by other cleaner sources, especially when looking ahead.
Yeah, I've written quite a bit on the issue of national oil companies and methane emissions and climate commitments more broadly. And Mexico's a really interesting case there. Probably not too much time to talk about Pemex, but you're right to draw that distinction between upstream versus downstream profitability. And I think the issue of Pemex not having enough retained capital to make the investments it needs to extend production and avoid these steep declines we've seen, it's going to be an ongoing issue. I want to ask about U.S.-Mexico energy trade. So you already highlighted this new situation where Mexico is incredibly dependent on natural gas imports from the United States. Makes a lot of economic sense. It's right across the border. A lot of gas looking for an export market. I think more than 2/3 of Mexican gas consumption now is met by U.S. gas imports, which is pretty remarkable. We even have LNG export terminals in Mexico that use U.S. gas that's shipped to these terminals and re-exported. Interesting phenomenon, probably raises some energy security questions. But more broadly, I think that's kind of been one of the few bright spots in cross-border energy trade, cooperation. But in general, it's not been a very happy period, let's say, for U.S.-Mexico energy cooperation. It feels like there's a lot of untapped potential, whether that's in renewable energy investments, whether it's in cross-border electricity transmission. Do you think this might improve under Sheinbaum?
Look, I think perhaps that there are some conditions for that to be met, but that very much depends on what's going to happen on this side of the border, right, in November. So I do think that depending on who wins there'll be much more space for that collaboration. We've seen an increased presence of that. For instance, John Kerry went multiple times to Mexico City, met directly with President Lopez Obrador, met directly with the ministers of energy, climate, economics, you name it. Will that happen under a Trump presidency? Hard to see, in my view. So I do think there's many aspects of collaboration really on across the border. And let's remember this on a broader aspect, right? Energy, we're energy nerds. We speak about all the time and think often that it's the most important issue in the world. And really, I think maybe we lose sight something of that energy as an enabler of other economic activities. One of that is trade. And so Mexico is the single largest trade partner of the United States, right? So it surpassed last year China. And I think that's a trend that is probably likely to increase and to bolden up. So I do think one very first role for energy there is to precisely perform as that enabler of that increased trade wave that we've seen, right? Like we are maybe a bit tired of listening of this buzzword of reshoring and friendshoring and so on. But, it's true that there is some relocation potential there. How much of that is being materialized till today? Debatable. But definitely there's a primary role to just give and provide reliable, affordable, and secure energy, mostly power, really. That's what we're talking about. And then I do think, like, for instance, with Texas, ERCOT, right? Or the Baja California Peninsula, which is not connected to the rest of the network in Mexico. I do think there's a lot of role for increased, just for reliability purposes, of connecting or further connecting more. They are connected, but it's very limited on the power sector. And definitely for some storage capacity, perhaps projects, and even if it makes sense for kind of newer technologies to materialize there. Things like green hydrogen may actually make sense there. A key constraint of that has been historically how to transport that potential green hydrogen to be produced. One of the possible solutions is through pipelines. If there is a region or a place that it makes sense to have those pipelines, perhaps it's there, right, in Mexico's northern border. So I do think there's some role there for complementarity and for further cooperation, but we'll see how it goes in the next coming months, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of potential for cross-border collaboration, integration on clean energy supply chains, given Mexico's manufacturing capacity and
Indeed.
Automotive sector and those historical links. And as you said, these two countries are such critical trade partners. And I appreciate your highlighting that energy and climate are only one of many important issues between these two countries, right? You've got security, narco trafficking, migration, and so on. So, Diego, what can we expect in terms of Mexico's climate commitments, a future NDC, the emissions pathway? What has incoming President Sheinbaum said about these things?
Yeah, that's a very interesting area that Mexico has a very ambitious goal, and we have very little detail on how is that going to achieve. So Mexico has NDC that was updated 2 years ago in the Egypt COP, in which it pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 35% in 2030. That represents a major rehauling on most highly emission sectors. And that brings us back to the energy sector, one of which the most relevant is in power, but also on transportation. Those are historically in Mexico. It changes sometimes year to year, but of which one is the highest emittent one. But really, to the extent that the power matrix can reduce its emissions, and to the extent that some of transportation could be more efficient and electrified, and as well using other new cleaner technologies, emissions will drop to a great extent. The other key aspect that I highlighted in a previous publication was really the methane emissions that you mentioned on national oil company Pemex. That's a major challenge that could be, even in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, profitable from a commercial standpoint, and that would contribute even to things like energy security. So that's definitely a very important area. Benny, if you allow me, I think we have some additional detail on how things could look ahead during the next 6 years for Claudia Sheinbaum in the energy sector, because she has already made some appointments of her cabinet. For instance, the Minister of Finance is repeating, but we have also the Minister of Energy appointed. Her name is Luz Helena González Escobar. And what we know about her, I think it's pretty interesting. She was Mexico City's former Minister of Finance, so somebody very close to Sheinbaum, somebody that is also capable economist, right? Like she has a long career doing that. And that also, it sends, I think, the message on one, finances are going to be very important on the energy sector. We're looking at it with detail. And two, this is somebody of her proximity, right? Like he's somebody of her full trust and confidence. There are two other key appointments to be made still, which is the head of the two state-owned companies that we've talked so much in this podcast, the head of Pemex and who's going to lead CFE. So that's going to be very important. That's expected to happen in the next days, in the next weeks. So as we're recording this on July 11th, we still don't know. So maybe when you're listening to this, we'll already know. So that's an important thing. One last thing that I wanted to highlight is that Claudia Sheinbaum has made a few interesting proposals, some of them included in her government program. And that is, I think, something that has been an area of opportunity in Mexico, which is long-term planning, having a long-term energy plan. And that, I think that's exactly what Mexico needs in different aspects, but with some really important areas, one of them being natural gas, and what it's going to be its role along the energy transition, and what is the longer term of all these energy sources and renewable power, of course, as emissions go down, while at the same time increasing energy demand. I think that's going to be absolutely essential. And to have that long-term view is very relevant, as well as an accent that she has pledged that I found pretty interesting on the demand sector, right? Things like electrifying transportation, but also energy access and energy efficiency on buildings and the residential sector. So I think that's something very relevant there.
It's such a fascinating moment for Mexican politics, and I really appreciate the way that you were able to connect the political landscape with both fossil fuels and renewable energy climate for us. So, Diego, thanks so much for being with us. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and it was my pleasure. Happy to do this another time later on.
Thanks to Diego and Ben for their insights. The CSIS Energy and Climate team will continue to look at these issues throughout the summer and fall. You can find more episodes of Energy 360 on our website, csis.org, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates from our team. And as always, thanks for listening.